Okay. Welcome to our new episode on the Woven Art channel. Today, we are excited to have Professor William B. Allen with us today. He is a professor of political philosophy, a former dean at Michigan State University, and the past chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Professor Allen has written several important books, including George Washington, a collection, George Washington, America's First Progressive, Rethinking Uncle Tom, The State of Black America, and his latest masterpiece, Montesquieu, The Spirit of the Laws, a critical edition. Um, Thank you very much for joining me tonight. I
Uh,
really appreciate it. It's actually a morning for you.
well, it's my honor, and I'm glad to be able to join you.
Thank you, thank you. And I would like to know if we can start by building the framework for how the Enlightenment came to be, what influenced the Enlightenment, and eventually how it affected the American founding fathers. And from that, I would like to ask many questions about what it means to be a responsible human being, a moral agent, and what it means to lead a virtuous life, and other things that I would like to ask you. So the stage
Well,
is yours, and thank you very much.
well, thank you very much, and I'm very happy to talk about this subject in particular because, as you know, it's been close to my heart for a long time. But more importantly, it has very recently become much more dramatically important to me because we've opened new doors of understanding, particularly regarding the effect of the Enlightenment on the American Revolution. But the first thing I want to be able to say is that we have customarily treated the Enlightenment as the introduction of atheism into the world. That is to say, skepticism about religious faith and about the very existence of God. And that proves to be something of a misleading take on the effect of the Enlightenment, especially on the American Revolution. For it is very true that there were elements, streams of thought that were definitely atheistic in the Enlightenment, beginning with the depreciation of the role of revelation and Machiavelli. But whether one looks at Machiavelli and Hobbes, who very explicitly tried to eliminate or to secularize, I'll put it that way, the biblical tradition, the actual fully developed Enlightenment took a somewhat different turn. And it took that different turn in the hands of Montesquieu, particularly, who referred to, of course, religion as centrally important in the development of free human society. Now, the important thing that is for us of value in contemplating the American Revolution is to remember what the American revolutionaries themselves did. They did, of course, read Enlightenment materials. They read also all the classical, historical, and philosophical ancient materials, and, of course, the Bible. The most frequently cited text in the American Revolution was Deuteronomy. Next, most frequently cited was the work of Montesquieu. And they often published statements of criticism of the work of Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was the person who said the first law of nature is to seek peace. And it is often ignored that he borrowed that from Psalms 34:14 and from 1 Peter. Originally, the expression occurs in Psalms, and there it says to the psalmist says to his readers, really channeling the divine voice, seek peace, pursue good, and pursue justice, and ensue peace is the word used in Psalms, and that turns into pursue peace in First Peter in the New Testament. So that religious injunction was an injunction to be other regarding. That's the point that I want to underscore here. Whereas Thomas Hobbes made it self regarding. Thomas
Mhm.
Hobbes's version of seek peace, the secular version, was each person is on his own. Life itself is nothing but fear after fear, and the fear of violent death in particular. And therefore, people had to submit to an absolute sovereign in order to assure social peace, to secure their personal interests and their personal safety. But the broader religious tradition did not focus on pursuing personal safety. It pursued the injunction in Micah 3:8, which is to say, what does your Lord your God ask of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And you doubtlessly know that George Washington channeled Micah 6:8 when he wrote in 1783 his circular address to the governors and people of the 13 states, which he closes by paraphrasing that passage from Micah 6:8, and therefore indicating that he was more solidly established in the biblical tradition and not the Hobbesian tradition. And it is for that reason that many American revolutionaries criticized Hobbes and referred to the anti-Hobbism that they thought was disastrous from the point of view of human society and human rights. So, which brings us to the Declaration of Independence, of course, which declares that the American revolutionaries not only were establishing themselves as an independent people, but they were doing so on the basis of the laws of nature and of nature's God. And those laws of nature disclose to them several rights, among which three are enumerated: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we may understand the pursuit of happiness precisely in light of the biblical injunction to pursue peace, seek the happiness that is described in the Declaration of Independence, as John Adams described it, means precisely what the Bible meant. And John Adams explained that prior to the Declaration of Independence when he drafted a proclamation for the General Court of Massachusetts in which he described and defined happiness as the end of society. But he went on to say what happiness means is the pursuit of virtue, of excellence. So that for the individual human being to be happy, that happiness has to be the consequence of pursuing a just and virtuous life and consistent with biblical injunctions. So the Enlightenment is a mixed picture from the point of view of revolutionary modernity, insofar as it did, of course, adopt and embrace the idea of the sovereignty of the people. It did embrace the idea of government broadly based on the interests of society, and it disclaimed, therefore, any exclusive claims of monarchy. And so that it really was a revision or reversion, if I can put it so, to the Hebrew Republic before the Hebrews asked God for a king. And the attempt of modernity in the background of the Enlightenment and natural law and religious instruction was precisely to try to recreate those fundamental conditions of the Hebrew Republic in the modern world. It has a strong secular strain, so please do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying it was creating a religious republic or a theocracy. What I'm saying is creating a free republic in which people freely embrace their obligations to God, which is why James Madison, who was one among many, was able to say in 1784 in his Memorial and Remonstrance, 1785 precisely, I correct myself, that the first obligation of a human being is to God, and that obligation comes before the obligation to civil society. So, what is the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment is nothing other than human beings taking responsibility for themselves and the development of their societies and the assurance of human rights without neglecting the commands of God. That's the political meaning of the modern Enlightenment, and that's what informed the American Revolution. Now, we can see this. I'll close with this, as I mentioned at the beginning, some new discoveries, which to me make this even more important, and that they come out of Montesquieu and the spirit of the laws. But they come indirectly out of Montesquieu because what I discovered subsequent to publishing my latest work was that King George III was a very close reader of Montesquieu and the spirit of the laws. He, in fact, so extensively paraphrased the work in his own hand that it was virtually a translation of the work itself. And he fully embraced the theories that were conveyed by Montesquieu, the theory of libertarian individualism, the interests of society as the basis of political rule and constitutionalism, and the monarch essentially is only the representative of the national interest and not the representative of the monarch's personal interests or his interests as monarch, but of the society as a whole. Montesquieu had described the monarchy in England as a republic disguised as a monarchy. And George III repeated that by describing it as a republic wearing the mask of a monarchy. And so George III came to power in 1760 with the goal in mind of realizing the principles of Montesquieu in the English Constitution. And his attempt to do that is what led to the period from 1760 to 1780, where there was a constant change in ministries in England because he was trying to reach a level in which he freed the English Constitution from what had been previously factionalism, the rule of a Whig oligarchy under his grandfather George II and the Prime Minister Robert Walpole. But he interpreted the eliminating faction, corrupt faction, as eliminating political party, which proved, of course, to be impossible because it was in fact the case that a faction was not necessarily identical with a party. And so the struggle that ensued was the struggle that produced for us what we could now understand as the programmatic political party. That is not a faction, but an association of individuals who enter into government to pursue a policy agenda. That's the programmatic political party. And it was the intervention and the invention of the programmatic political party that characterized the revolutionary era, both in England and in the United States. But it happened separately in the two, and that's what lay behind the separation of the two nations in the end. They were both working their way to a new constitutional foundation, and the kinds of political conflicts and turmoils in the presence of that is what made the American Revolution necessary. But all of that takes place in the background of having embraced and adopted Enlightenment principles.
And that's incredible. So while he is trying to apply liberal reforms in his constitution, he's losing the 13 colonies in the process.
Precisely, precisely, for political reasons.
Wow. Okay. I would like to ask, please, you mentioned in one of your lectures the four cardinal foundations about virtue, liberty, constitution, and justice. Can you
Yes.
please elaborate on that?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And the best way for me to do that is to put it in a broader context. What the arguments of Montesquieu provide for us is a defense of what we can call natural society. So that Montesquieu abandoned the idea of an artificial society. The artificial society was the social contract society, which you will know is where philosophers like Hobbes and Locke said people who were separate individuals came together in an atmosphere, a sphere for mutual security and formed a society. Montesquieu says no, human beings began by forming families and following natural instincts. And society grew up around that. It's a natural society. So, this idea of society being natural and the foundation of human politics replaced the idea of the artificial society. Now, there was one person in England in particular who developed that idea to the fullest extent, and that person was Edmund Burke. We often see people remember Edmund Burke as the great conservative, but they don't realize that he was actually part of the radical faction in British party politics. And yes, he did not embrace all radicalism. For example, he didn't embrace universal suffrage in the way that Charles Lennox, the third Duke of Richmond, did. But he did embrace the government based fundamentally in the House of Commons, representing the people, and the development of the programmatic political party. And he did that in light of his first professional work, which was called The Vindication of the Rights of Natural Society. So he, like Montesquieu, wanted natural society, not artificial society, to be the basis of politics and developed, therefore, the appropriate theories and political approaches to try to realize that particular aim. So basing political life, all of society, on the family means one thing above all else, that everything has to revert back to the family. That the society, the political institutions, the Constitution grow out of the family and must therefore sustain respect for the family, must give the family a privileged position. And by family, we mean quite simply mother, father, children. And then, of course, the collateral developments, cousins, etc., that grow out of that. So making that fundamentally important was what created the basic foundations for modernity in the work of Edmund Burke and in the work of the development of the Constitution of the United States. So what we can say then, with respect to the question you're raising, is that we get out of Montesquieu and the others who were engaged in this process the opportunity to turn our attention back to the question of what are the objectives of a constitution. And that prime objective is to limit governmental power. So the whole idea of unlimited power or absolute sovereignty in the agents rather than sovereignty in the people is completely discarded. And if we're going to limit that power, that means that we're going to give privilege to the rights of the human beings themselves, but understanding those human beings in the context of families.
So it's a very interesting thing, and I would like to divert for a second. We see today the destruction of the family, which
Yes.
eventually leads to a bigger government, and the people are like in a perpetual state of handouts, seeking governmental help and more intervention. So, do you see a connection between the destruction of the family and what was meant originally by Montesquieu and others, basically to have politics as a way to limit the power of the government, to limit the power of direct control, and uh, how do
You,
you? Yes.
you've summarized it completely and very well. I see that what has happened is we have developed what I call the wardship society. So what I mean by the word wardship, I'll give an example. When we have orphan children, we often have to establish some kind of public wardship for them, somebody to take care of them, stewards of these lost individuals. Well, what we've seen develop in our own time is government treat all people as lost individuals, and government does the ward for everybody. And it's this government wardship that leads to the handouts from government to individuals, providing fundamental security for individuals rather than having and relying upon individuals to do that for themselves. And we saw this transition begin, of course, in the 19th century through all of the developments that produced the welfare state. But it reached its consummation in the United States, at least, in the work of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, in his Charter of Freedoms, described government precisely as a ward of the people and made the argument that
It's the
people
New
couldn't
Deal,
be
right?
free. It's the New Deal, right?
Mhm.
And the argument there was that people can't be free until they are made comfortable and safe. And of course, the original view was that people can only be comfortable and safe if they're free.
I understand. Maybe we can go back a little and speak about the freedom of conscience and
Yes.
where people who are supposed to enact their moral agency, where do they get their virtues from, and what is their obligation to God as maybe the first step before their obligation to civil society?
That's exactly the point to begin, because it is the freedom of conscience which is the basis of free society. And that freedom of conscience means, of course, that one is answerable to God for one's conduct. And so one has to be, of course, free in order to respond to the obligations to God. And therefore, government cannot interfere, cannot stand in the way of that. But that also means something else. It means that government is fundamentally what we call self government. Now, we have tended to develop the idea that self government is essentially a matter of what we would call majority rule or democracy. But that's not what was meant originally. Self government originally meant reliance upon the people primarily, and the people understood as self governing individuals, moral agents, people capable of virtue, of pursuing excellence. And therefore, it leads to George Washington in his first inaugural address making the explicit statement that the idea of a free society without virtue and religion is an impossibility, i.e., it is not the government that produces virtue, it is virtue in the people that produces the government. And so, this notion that people are moral agents is critical not just for the sake of individual futures, it's critical for the sake of social organization. If you can't rely on the virtue of citizens, then you have no justification for expecting any virtue in the exercise of governmental power.
So basically, the expression of government is a mirror of the kind of virtues or the lack of the identity of people today. So
Yes.
maybe you can speak about what you see in education today that is like draining this virtue-based identity, and what can maybe be done about that, because it feels like our new generation is completely hollowed out. There is no essence. There is no it's like they are not seeking for anything higher, and especially they don't speak the language of virtue. I don't think they even understand it. They are not trying to lead a virtuous life, and I think this is a systematic thing that is coming from the academics, and I think this is the center place where the ideological war is taking place, where you have these collectivist ideas like neo-Marxism or postmodernism and all those very radical ideologies, basically subverting the culture, the civil society that you're speaking about. So maybe you can speak about that in great length, because this is very important today.
Well, it is important, and it is true that you can put your finger squarely on the academy for these developments. The famed sociologist Edward Shills, in the era of the 1930s, made the observation that others also made, that the university had replaced the church as the moral arbiter for society. And that was true. The university became the place people began to turn reflexively for guidance in the development of moral principles and public policies. But unfortunately, during that same period, the university was hollowing out all moral principles. It was embracing moral and cultural relativity. It was embracing even forms of nihilism. And it therefore began to attack moral foundations rather than to build up and sustain moral foundations. And this, of course, has unavoidably an impact upon the generations who are developed under the guidance of these academics and who become less and less prone to having resort to moral principles in the explanation of and justification of conduct, and more prone to asserting will, who have embraced the modernist idea that there is nothing but will and we can shape the world however we choose. Now, this idea of the arbitrary power of human beings to shape their own natures, this fundamentally Rousseauian concept, lies at the root of our moral rot. We can't change our nature. We can't shape our nature. We can only fulfill our nature. And that's what the pursuit of happiness was about. So that what the academy has done in its various forms in which it has undermined the authority of religious and moral principles was to disable people from the habitual recourse to moral reasoning in order to determine courses of conduct. Now, the lack of moral reasoning has to be replaced by something because human nature will not tolerate a vacuum, and therefore it's replaced by the assertions of will. And one of the most prime examples of this is, of course, the emergence of the idea of identity itself. And you have to stop and ponder what this strange word means, because we can talk about identifying phyla and classes of organisms and species and genuses, but what does it mean to identify an individual? Well, an individual is only identified in terms of belonging to a class, technically. So when people begin to assert that they have their own identities detached from class, they're basically saying they are detached from nature itself and that they have no natural or moral obligations. They can, in fact, be whatever they choose to be. And guess what? We live in the world of identity fluidity, which has manifested itself most dramatically in the form of so-called gender fluidity. And there you see the ultimate oxymoron, that we are born without any determination as to gender, but broader, we're born without any determination whatever. We can make ourselves male or female. We can make our, you would almost think you could make yourselves short or tall. The idea that we could make ourselves what we will, rather than living what we are to the fullest and seeking the perfection of what we were born to be, we think we make ourselves into what we wish to be without any limitation at all on our wishes. But if there's no limitation on our wish for the identity we want to make, that means, of course, there is no divine order. There's nothing God intended us to be, and nothing God requires us by the virtue of our very creation to be. So what this means is an attitude of defiance to the order of nature. That's what prevails in our time. This attitude of defiance to the order of nature, which means not only that we could remake ourselves, but we could remake the universe. We can control the climate. We can control the constellation in which we live. There is no limit to our ambition to assert control. The trouble is, who's doing the controlling? If we define ourselves as undefined and making our own identity, well, nobody's in control. Mere will, arbitrary and infinite, can be anything at any time. So we make an argument for control with no argument for who's going to be in control. And that describes the modern era.
So, if, for example, you, from your great experience and knowledge, would sit down with a new parents and would have to advise them, considering our secular society, the indoctrination in school, the atomization of our individuals in society, and the lack of purpose, how would you go about telling them to reverse this very dangerous process? Like, how do you redefine and go back to the source and allow the children to develop properly?
I begin by saying beware experts. Beware experts. And I'll give you an illustration of this from my personal life. I was living abroad in France at the time my first child was conceived. And that became an anxious moment for my wife at the time because she didn't have access. She was not at home in the United States, didn't have access to all the materials we were accustomed to seeing, and in particular, the various books by the so called child rearing experts, etc. And we
Mhm.
remember some of those who they were from the 1940s and afterwards. And I looked at her and I said, well, it's true. We can't pull up a handbook that tells us how to parent. But let's ask a question about this. What did human beings do long before those books were written? How did they feed children before baby food was available? What resources did they rely upon? And I described parents who would take their nutrition, macerate it in their mouths, and then take it out and feed it to their children. A very natural thing to do, which one does by instinct because it's intuitive. And one doesn't rely on buying a little bottle with baby food macerated in a machine. So I said, we know we have the resources and the ability to do what's required to raise children for the simple reason that people have always raised children. And we are people such as they were. So we begin by being beware of experts. And it's fine to take advantage of modern technologies, and it's fine to have recourse to data and research and evidence. But to depend on it is fatal. One mustn't depend on it. And we learned that in the pandemic. For what happens with experts who become engaged in public policy is they cease to act as experts and act as rent seeking agents of public authority. And that means that they freely mislead and abuse, and that their so called expertise does not lead necessarily to uh, efficiency or even helpful instruction.
I understand. Do you think homeschooling is the right thing to do nowadays?
I found wonderfully successful examples of homeschooling, and it is certainly necessary where you have schools that fail to deliver the basics of humanity. And that's true of so many schools these days. People say, well, if you don't send your children to school, they can't be socialized. Not true. You have homeschool associations where people get together, they form sports leagues, they have other forms of engagement, co curricular. There's a lot of socialization just by living in communities. It is socialization does not need to be structured by a formal pedagogy. And in fact, it's better unstructured by formal pedagogy. So, yes, I do urge people who are in a position to do so to pursue homeschooling
Mhm.
because they are in a better position to open up the entire universe to their children than ideologues in a public school who seek to confine and constrict them and even hide from the parents what the children are doing.
Absolutely. Um, I would like to read my question. Um, if we want to revisit the philosophical roots of liberty, how can we no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Um, Basically, my question is like, what kind of sources from the past, from all those giants that Western civilization is basically sitting on, uh, who, who should we read? What should we go back to as proper influence on the way we should develop as a responsible individuals, free individuals?
Well, I have two answers for that question. And one is for the individual, the curious mind, the intelligence. Uh, do what human beings have always done, join the great conversation. What do I mean by the great conversation? I mean all those great works of the past that have spent hours reflecting on the fundamental human questions. And they include, of course, the famous religious texts, the famous historical and philosophical texts. Let me give an example. Herodotus. Read Herodotus. See the way in which Herodotus, canvassing the differing cultures of the region that in which he lived and about which he wrote, arrived at the conclusion that many things can be shared across cultures, except for one thing: religious faith. It
And he
does
was
not.
wrong.
He was wrong, precisely. He
Yeah.
said that does not communicate, that does not transfer. But he was wrong. And so, reading him and understanding why he said that, and reading the whole tradition and coming to understand why he was wrong, gives us a powerful position to understand where we stand in the world. We say, for example, when we look at the history of the Hebrew people, that uh, here is a people who have done something that no other people in the world have ever done. None, ever. That is to say, that their society was destroyed. Jerusalem several times, finally in 70 AD, until only most recently recovered again. And yet, Israel was never destroyed in the hearts and souls of the people. Dispersed throughout the earth, Israel still survived, sufficiently so that it finally comes, as was prophetically seen, to be reestablished. Now, that's a
Hmm.
powerful example of what it means to embrace principles and traditions and to make them the living heart of one's own existence. And we can learn a lot from that because what we know happens in most societies is what I refer to as the Carthaginian peace. And you know what the Carthaginian peace is like. Carthage
Hmm.
no longer exists and never will again. That's the
Yes.
Carthaginian peace. Well,
Yes.
that happens to most societies. Most, even great constitutions, eventually have disappeared, whether Spartan or Roman, etc. So what we want to know is what gives a constitution, a people, a way, a culture, a way of life, any chance of permanence. And the best example we have of that is the example of the Hebrew people in all of human history, even more than, say, the Asiatic, Chinese, or even Japanese civilizations, because they have undergone such great changes that it's impossible to say that they are still what they once were. So it seems to me it is that kind of reading in the classic tradition is my first answer. The first part of the answer to your question is fundamental. Read all the history, all the philosophy, and even the great literature. Understand the Iliad and the Odyssey in their context, but in their human light as well as their immediate context. And then the second part of the answer is pay attention to our own traditions, and not in the form of reading secondary sources, not even my own, but in the form of reading the works of those who founded the traditions themselves. Read what those who sailed on the Mayflower had said about their journey, and those afterwards who settled in the Plymouth plantations and in the Massachusetts colony. Read them. Read the revolutionaries in their own words, not interpreted. Because it turns out that they all interpret themselves brilliantly in ways that are irresistible. And that continues through the traditions of all societies, and in the United States in particular, it continues through the great spokesmen for freedom, the people like Abraham Lincoln. Read Lincoln, just as you should read Churchill anywhere in the world for similar reasons. It turns out the people who give the greatest attention to these things tend to be people who say and write a lot. Even George Washington, people didn't think of George Washington as a great intellect, and they're very mistaken about that. But the corpus of his writings fills more volumes than than almost any of the other American founders. It should be read because it's highly instructive. And then, as we are proceeding in that manner, we slowly approach our own day and time, where we don't read everything that's written because we know how many millions of titles are written in the modern world. But we read very carefully and intelligently about those who seem most likely to sustain the great conversation. Read the ones who go back to the traditions and describe them and discuss them in our own context. I think following those two approaches is quite adequate to give us the strength that we need to rebuild society here in the United States and in the Western world at large.
Um, if you go back and read all of that and open yourself to all those ideas, some of those ideas, especially some of those philosophies, have been, I think, weaponized against us. And
Yes.
I would like to ask if you can recognize already in the time of the Enlightenment counter Enlightenment philosophers who put our society at risk already then, and if you can maybe create a link between those philosophers to today's, so we can recognize the enemy
Oh,
and be
yes,
careful.
yes, yes. I think, for example, Herbert Marcuse,
Oh,
who taught a repressive tolerance in the
yeah.
1960s, 70s, can be traced all the way back to Rousseau from the Enlightenment. No question about it. I think the whole idea of absolute sovereignty or absolute power in government can be traced back through the Enlightenment. And it comes forward to today when today it's not the programmatic political party I described Edmund Burke as creating, but the ideological party that tends to be the greatest threat to us. And the reason, and let me distinguish between the ideological party and the programmatic political party. I said before, the programmatic political party pursues a policy agenda. So it has arrived at certain policy prescriptions in the national interest that it wants to realize in power. But it doesn't foreclose discussion. It does this in a deliberative environment, a deliberative assembly. It expects to have opposition presented and to test itself against the opposition. And if it falls to the opposition, it steps aside. That's the programmatic party. The ideological party admits no discussion, expects no opposition, and demands absolute power. And the ideological party, of course, grew out of the French Revolution and the traditions succeeding that. So we know what to look for. If somebody says, I'm in favor of any abstract principle, socialism, communism, you name it, they are declaring that they want to establish an ideological party in complete control which cannot accept the rule of any other opinion. Avoid them at all cost. They
Mhm.
are the source of destruction. The programmatic party, even when you disagree with it, can be embraced because it sustains the opportunity for discussion and deliberation. It expects opposition, and opposition can often prevail.
Why Montesquieu was so influential on the forefathers in America, but failed to how to say it, like, um, help me here.
Yeah.
Um, he didn't have the same effect in France.
He
Instead,
didn't have the
Rousseau
same.
was able to
Yeah.
be the philosopher of the revolution, the third wave of the Jacobinism. So why
Yes.
is it like that?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I know that it happened. I think part of it is because in France, in the era of Montesquieu, you had some other traditions. You had Voltaire, Diderot, l'Encyclopédie. You had some fairly radical and more or less atheistic streams. And remember how the French Revolution eventuated in the attack on the church,
Hmm.
at the end, the overthrow of religious symbolism.
Yes.
Well, that seemed to be a direct descent from those philosophical traditions that were counter Montesquieuian, that were Voltairean. And they were the ones that had become wildly popular at a certain point and were embraced as the revolutionary spirit took hold. And as de Tocqueville said, Alexis de Tocqueville in his book on the Ancien Regime, the French aristocracy led the way to the French Revolution by detaching itself from the French people with whom it had previously been closely attached. So it
Hmm.
seems that what undermined Montesquieu's um, more comprehensive theory and constitutionalism was precisely this quasi aristocratic embrace of the most radical tendencies. It's the opposite of what we think. It wasn't a popular embrace. The popular embrace came secondarily. It was the aristocratic embrace of those radical tendencies that produced the results in France. So, if you go back to what your previous question asked me about the cardinal virtues, the cardinal human goods, so the virtue, liberty, justice, and constitutionalism, what we see in those is a requirement to understand that it is still necessary to have virtue at the foundation of society. Montesquieu, of course, divided virtue into political virtue and moral virtue, which was sensible. He described political virtue as the love of equality. But the love of equality can veer in the direction of ideology, as it did in the hands of Rousseau. Montesquieu limited it, of course, by tying it to a specific constitution, which could only thrive in a very small area, and which was not therefore sufficient for his modern purposes, which is why he then developed the concepts of liberty, justice, and constitutionalism. And remember, the justice was fundamentally based on human rights, not the rights particular to any one society. So that it was liberated in a certain sense from the willfulness of the ideological party, as you saw take place in the hands of a Robespierre or others during the Revolutionary era. And the constitutionalism was, of course, the framework in which the practice of virtue, liberty, and justice could be embraced. And we know that in the spirit of the laws, the justice is signified in the central books that attack the idea of slavery itself on human grounds. So that what Montesquieu has done is to say, you have to tie your moral judgments and commitments to a broad constitutional frameworks that limits the power of politics to interfere with morality, interfere with justice. You don't expect morality and justice from politics. You limit politics in order to be moral and just.
I understand. Um, if we look at today's America, for example, and if we bring the forefathers back to life and we let them see
Mhm.
the experiment, how it evolved, I'm sure they are not going to be very satisfied. And I wonder what allowed in the Enlightenment or the way they written the Constitution for that to become the monstrosity we see today. Like, what is the backdoor that allows
Uh,
those
yes. Yeah, that back door has always been there and must always be there. Uh, Here's how I describe it. I describe it as openness to good-willed abandonment. If you're going to build government on the basis of the authority of the people, you have to accept the principle that you cannot predetermine the people's exercise of that authority. The two things do not go together. Either the people have the authority or they do not. If they have it, as Abraham Lincoln said, everything depends on their opinions. When their opinions are sound, the government will be sound. If their opinions become unsound, they may abandon the very government itself. With the best of intentions, mind you. That's why I call it good-willed abandonment. But when opinion goes awry, so do political prospects. And that is a necessary correlate to free government. It's not avoidable. What is avoidable is the corruption of opinion through steady instruction and cultivation. That's why Lincoln worked so hard to reinstill in the people of his era the principle of equality as the foundation, the Declaration of Independence as the basis for American society, because they were losing it. The opinion was being corrupted. And so he fought against that corruption, ultimately successfully for a time. But we know that corruption returns. It returns in many forms. And so at each era, that battle must be fought anew. The battle must always be fought anew to save opinion, for opinion is the only thing that saves free government.
I understand. If I may ask you about natural law,
Mhm.
what is the source of that? I mean, obviously, most people will say that the source of natural law and our in ali- inalienable rights are coming from
Mhm.
from God. But
Mhm.
can we also make the case for a secular natural law? And if so, who articulated it before? And is that like something we can build our society upon? The
Well,
understanding of
yeah, the best
something
answer to
that
your
comes from
question.
our humanity, I mean.
Yes, absolutely. And the best answer to your question as to who most articulated that relationship is, of course, Thomas Aquinas, who worked very carefully through Aristotle, primarily, but other texts as well, to show how the elaboration of divine law and natural law were perfectly coherent and consistent with each other. And he even went so far as to say in his Summa Contra Gentiles that one can even through reason find one's way to God. That is to say, persuade oneself, see the reality of God's existence. One cannot achieve the divine relationship or salvation, as we put it most generally, by reason, but one can discover by reason God exists, and therefore the same process that produces our understanding of the existence of God is the process that produces our understanding of natural law. In that sense, he joins with Cicero and others who believed that the natural law was, of course, compelling to the precise extent that our reason unfolded it to us. So it is a rational process to lead to that, but we must understand this rational process in the broader context. In a recent sermon, among other things, I expressed it in the following terms. I said, the human soul was created to dwell on God. That's the purpose of the human soul. That's the purpose of human reason. And if that's the case, it is inescapable that the human reason works its way up from its own particularity to the most transcendent level, i.e., outside and beyond itself. And it is working from within to without that human beings discover the natural limits and therefore the natural laws. And as they discover the natural laws, they discover what lies beyond, or some might say behind, the natural law. So the order of nature is compelling, but it is not concluding. And this so confuses people. How can nature be compelling but not concluding? But of course, you know, Montesquieu answers that question in the first book of the Spirit of the Laws. He says that there are really four kinds of law. Right? There's divine law, natural law, and there's, of course, the positive law, human law, we'll put it that way. And there is, of course, the law of religion. Now, what he says about those laws is that they are um, successively binding on human beings to a less degree. So the reason human beings have the lesser laws is because the greater laws require human beings to conform through their own reason, unlike the other beings. Other beings follow their laws, their natural laws, automatically. We say instinctively, but we can say automatically. They don't have to ask whether to be a dog or a gorilla or a lion or whatever. They just are. Well, human beings have something they're required to be as human beings, but they must participate in carrying it out, which means they're liable to error and therefore sometimes are mistaken about it. And they require to be reminded. And they're reminded through philosophy, through religious instruction. And that means then the reminding human beings of their laws is the process is what that leads them to the discovery of natural law, what it really demands of them, rather than what they imagined it to a man. Montesquieu described ignorance as being not knowing a particular thing, but not knowing oneself,
Hmm.
ignorant of oneself. Well, that means, in a sense, ignorant of natural law. And so the way to overcome ignorance of natural law is fully to do what? What Socrates said, "Note se auton," know thyself.
Yes. I heard you mentioning that you no longer define yourself as Christian or whatever denomination. You say that you follow the way.
Yes.
Okay, and if I'm not mistaken, in today's Western society, it seems like it's very secularized, and
Mhm.
so in many ways we lost the way,
Yes.
the way you are mentioning. Is there any secular alternative to be able to reach back to the foundations of the Enlightenment and to bring back the responsibility of the individual and all that civil society that we are talking about without apply to divinity,
Well,
in your opinion?
that's a great question. I often reflect upon that, and here's the way I shape the question to myself. I ask, what responsibilities to God do atheists have? Because the atheists, of course, deny that they have any responsibility to God. But what I have realized is, yes, they do have a responsibility to God because they are comprehended in the universal command, in the freedom of conscience. We see that because atheists claim a freedom of conscience. Now, here's a paradox. How can people who do not believe in God or any basis for conscience claim freedom of conscience? Well, they can't reasonably. What they're doing, therefore, is responding to God, but doing so without knowing that they're responding to God in error, with mistaken understanding. So they are comprehended in the general commands of God and nature. And therefore, we say, yes, there's a secular path back, simply working through and understanding why it is people make the demands of themselves and others that they make. Why do atheists believe they should have a freedom of opinion when they don't believe there's a foundation for any opinion? How do you solve that contradiction in terms? You only resolve it by indicating that they were mistaken to begin with. And I must apologize that I forgot to turn my telephone off. So
It's
let's
okay,
get rid of this right away. Okay, sorry.
no problem.
Now we turn it off just to make sure. Okay.
Yes. When you look at today's world, especially America, Europe, everything that is happening with immigration, everything that is happening with the woke, uh, crazy ideology, in my
Hmm.
opinion, everything that happens with abortions, and it
Yes.
seems like the world is everything goes insane in a way. I'm sorry, I'm not very politically correct. Um, do you see hope? Do you see that this is going to reverse itself, or are we going to find ourselves even in worse times before, if ever, it gets better?
Well,
What is
I
your
see hope.
opinion?
I see hope. I see that the things that trouble us now will get better. But I must tell you, I'm also a realist, and I see that there will be new troubles. There will be new corruptions to replace the present corruptions. Um, Take the question of abortion. This is an interesting question in so many ways because it involves a wide-scale child sacrifice, which is an ancient pagan sin.
Molech. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so you ask, well, how do people in the modern era, above all, who have terrible opinions about pagan practices, themselves fall into that? Well, it's a kind of self-indulgence. We talked earlier about identity, and they persuaded themselves that they must retain this degree of personal choice in order to be free. But of course, they're terribly mistaken in that. But the mistake is not in the how can I put this? It is not the mistake that we see in the political oppositions between the so-called pro-choice and anti-abortion. Everybody can acknowledge that some abortions are going to be necessary for technical reasons. That's going to happen. But everybody should also be able to acknowledge that abortion should never be chosen
Hmm.
for moral reasons. So we will eventually come to see that that's the point at which we may have to stand. That the constant reiteration of that argument will eventually prevail. Just as today, almost no one fails to deny that the unborn child is an unborn child. You know, there was a time early on when people refused to say that. They would say it's just a lump of tissue. It's just, they prefer to use the word fetus because we all remember what fetus is. That's what we studied in high school biology, and it was a salamander, so we didn't have to worry about any moral implications. Well, we've gotten past that now. People understand and accept unborn child. And that means eventually we will see that this can't be a matter of something we choose. If it happens to us, it must happen of necessity. And of course, when it does, we must assure that it takes place in the finest conditions and support for health care and all the rest of that. But it should be something that only happens of necessity, and by definition, that will happen but rarely. Now, once we've gotten there, we will be free from the struggle over abortion. But we will not be free from the struggle over corrupt opinions. There will be new corrupt opinions that will emerge. And we've already seen the leading edge of this in the development of transgenderism, which is an offshoot of the abortion dispute. That's going to disappear. But there are bound to be others. It's the same thing that happens. Let me give something that's less morally freighted, something that you can be even indifferent about, but which I think shows the way for us. Let us take college athletics.
Hmm.
For a long time, college athletes have been exploited. I mean, in the large institutions that make millions of dollars and give the athletes nothing. But gradually, over time, that is being overthrown. Now, the first time I wrote about that injustice was over 35 years ago. And so that's how long it's taken before we've gotten to the point where no longer is it the case that you can deny to these very talented individuals just compensation for their contributions. It took that long to do what seems intuitive and obvious. And that's the way many of these things go. And I use that example because it doesn't carry so much moral baggage to show that we sometimes have to go through a long slog of argument and moral reasoning to get people to see the light.
Yes. I wonder, how do you convince young, like a man and a woman in their early years, in the beginning of their life, to appreciate and value the importance of building a family? Because it seems like if you look at Korea, South Korea, for example, Japan, and several other European countries, the birth rate is already 0.85%.
Yeah.
Sorry, a child, and this is unsustainable. And how do you convince them to basically change their um, preference for that, like to come back to their senses and understand that
Yes.
basically family is the, as you said earlier, is the foundations of everything.
Well, you're not going to get them back into church, so you can't do it that way directly. It's going to be a long time for them to get back to church, but there's a technical way to do it. Wage compression. If you eliminate the extraordinary inequalities in wages for those who gain college educations as opposed to those who do not, if you begin to compress the wages between the lowest earners and the higher earners in the early years, you will create more opportunity for marriages and family. Today, it's not happening because there's such a great division between those who have high school or less and those who have more than high school. And the idea of sorting is difficult. They're having trouble finding partners and making commitments to one another. It's because of the economic differences. But as you compress that and people are able to envision living off of their earnings compatibly and without having a great divide between one group and the other, you will foster more marriages and more childbirth. Now, that's simply a technical response, but I think it's true.
Yes. Well, I really hope the people who are making the decisions will take that into consideration as well. I actually back to those with the college diplomas and everything. Do you feel that university in the humanities and stuff like that, it's still focusing on free inquiry, or is it more like a system of dogmatic, like to create conformist and obedient people who are just going to accept whatever narrative those ideologues are pushing?
It is vocational training, which always comes freighted with ideology. Yes, it is not pursuing free and open inquiry. The idea that people in college should most and first of all challenge their own beliefs, that doesn't happen any longer. There are some institutions here and there that are attempting it, some new ones being created in the United States that attempt it. But by and large, that is not what happens. By and large, it is strictly vocational training, limited liberal education. And that, of course, is really very destructive. In my book that I wrote with my wife, Habits of Mind, I describe this at some great length as a great danger for our society because it means really turning university education into what high school education used to be.
I see. Last question, if I may. What is your opinion about art, today's art, and what is the purpose of art in the way you see it?
Well, that's something I rarely ever comment upon. But I will say I do have reactions to it. The I find little in today's art that engages my reflective attention, whereas classical art, architecture, and music always deeply engages me. That there's something about the structure and expression of it that lifts the soul beyond itself.
Yes.
Whereas modern art tends to imprison the soul within itself, tends to turn the eye and the ear of the observer inward rather than outward. And so I don't have much um, affection for most forms of modern expression. There are exceptions to that. There's a lot of jazz, especially early jazz,
Hmm.
for which I have great affection. But in general, you'll find me spending more time with the classical structures than with the more recent structures. So I would say of modern art, yes, there are some examples of true greatness here and there, musically and otherwise, although they tend increasingly to be more remote in time, at least in my experience.
Hmm.
The most recent, I find few examples that really retain my attention. I think, for example, you take the opera, which is greatly appreciated by many people, Nixon in China. I just
By
can't.
Philip Glass, you mean?
Yes,
Hmm.
I just don't get there. I'm sorry, but I just don't get there.
Me too. Me too. I would highly recommend you a modern composer. His name is Arvo Part. He's from Lithuania.
Okay.
It's like bringing Bach. into the present. So
Oh, well,
maybe you should try that.
I shall try to find him. I haven't heard him. That's
Yeah.
great.
I actually feel that the art today is projecting the corruption of the mind and the heart of the people in our society. It's like we have been attacked on every aspect of our life, and eventually it's all being projected to art,
Yeah,
and it's like mirroring back who we became, and the decadence, the level of decadence that is like so typical of the average Joe, who is like not asking the kind of questions you were like speaking about.
yeah. That's the nihilism that has so infected us.
Yeah,
No
it's
question about it.
yeah. Anyway, I think our time is up, and I would like to thank you with all my heart for your time and your insights and knowledge, and for all that you do. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, thank you very much, John. It's been a delight for me to participate with you.
Thank you, sir.
God
Thank you
bless
very
you.
much. God bless you too.
Okay.